Friends, welcome. Welcome back. Folks who are watching online, folks who are here in the sanctuary. As I began to frame my thoughts for my sermon this morning, my teacher of Torah was actually Eric Ward. And I read his article called Skin in the Game, which is from, I don't know, a few years ago, Eric. I can't remember what the date of it is. I read the article a little while back, and then I've heard Eric speak in a couple of different contexts. And as I began to think about this topic, his words and his teachings kept echoing in my mind and in my ears. I thought I knew and understood anti-Semitism in some depth, and then I reread Eric's article and heard him speak and realized how much more I needed to learn. You heard this morning from me about why I think this topic is so important. It was clear to me as I thought about a guest speaker for this afternoon to reflect on anti-Semitism, on the coalitions that we need to build, and on the work that we need to do, that Eric was the person that I wanted to have speak with us. And I'm immensely grateful that he was willing to spend some time. He actually watched the sermon this morning, which is great, and I'm grateful to him. And he just told me that because he knows it's Yom Kippur, he's also fasting today, because he figured for people who are going to be fasting and listening to him, he figured he should fast as well. So that is a rare kind of solidarity, and I'm grateful. So Eric, it is a great honor to have you. Let me read a brief bio, and we're really eager to hear from you. Eric Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. In his more than 30-year civil rights career, he's worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy as an organizer, director, program officer, consultant, and board member. The recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award, Eric's widely quoted writings and speeches are credited with key narrative shifts. He currently serves as executive director of the Western State Center, senior fellow with Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, and co-chair for the Proteus Fund. It is our great honor to have Eric with us. Eric, we have about 70 participants online, and I would say about 30 people here in the sanctuary, and others may join. We're grateful to you for being with us, and I'm wondering if you could contextualize what you've been speaking about and thinking about and teaching when it comes to anti-Semitism for us on this holy day.
Absolutely. It is such an honor to be with you all today on this very solemn day. And, my story begins in Los Angeles, Southern California. I'm the third generation of 5 generations of Los Angeles. My family fled racial terror and bigotry, and eventually migrated after the lynching of Mary Thompson of Shepherdsville, Kentucky in the early 1900s, and fled to Los Angeles. I grew up at the time of desegregation of the Los Angeles School District, the Long Beach Unified School District, which had a huge impact on my life and the life of friends in my neighborhood and friends that I came to know. While we don't think of California necessarily as segregated, the truth is that while not living under the Jim Crow rules of the South, racial segregation was a real reality, and so was economic segregation. So in the early 80s, for a brief moment, those walls fell, and many of us found ourselves thrown into new communities with one another. Now, we didn't have much in common, right, at the time, but luckily for us, 2 significant things happened. The first was that our parents, for the most part, right, across the racial and economic spectrum, hadn't caught up to desegregation, really. And so for a brief moment, right, before the resegregation began, many of us got to spend time with one another in ways we hadn't. Now, race and economics weren't going to be the bridge that gave us an identity. And remember, we're junior and high school students. So the first thing we want to do, right, is to try to belong. Luckily for us, our parents yet hadn't figured it out. So there's this moment where we were all together. And the vehicle for many of us became music, the arrival of hip hop, punk, and disco, right, onto the scene. For many of us, we crossed these lines of race and economy through a new identity, which was music. I was involved in the music scene in Los Angeles, particularly within the punk, reggae, and ska scenes. I was the original singer of a band that went on to become known as Sublime. Many of you may have heard of this. But this was happening in a very tumultuous time in Southern California. We were going to shows together. And increasingly, we began to encounter and be confronted by individuals who called themselves either Nazi punks or white power skinheads, who were beginning to dominate the scene through physical violence and dictating, right, who and who could not belong into that scene. Not knowing much at the time, we fought back in the way that we were experiencing. People were physically assaulting us, so we began to physically stand up for ourselves. Eventually, I moved up to the Pacific Northwest with four other friends, two who were going on to the University of Oregon, three of us who just wanted to live beyond the age of 25. I grew up in deep poverty. I grew up at a time of segregation, as I said, and moving to Oregon seemed like a good way forward. Well, I wasn't the only person who was looking for a new life. Just a few years ahead of me, Rabbi, another individual by the name of Richard Butler, he was a pastor who had retired from Hughes Aircraft in Southern California. He oversaw a church, and he relocated that church also to the Pacific Northwest. Instead of going to Oregon, though, he went to Idaho, and he planted his church in a place called Hayden Lake, just outside of Coeur d'Alene. And the name of his church was Jesus Christ Christian, the Church of Aryan Nations. The Aryan Nations taught three things. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were subhuman. And the third was that white Northern Europeans were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Now, I didn't know all of what that meant, but I did know the outcomes of that movement. We were facing much of the things that Americans across the country are experiencing now that first started here in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, January 6th, the insurrection, I can't even believe I'm using this word, insurrection on the Capitol in DC, started in the 1980s here in the Pacific Northwest. There were killings, the murder of a Jewish radio talk show host by the name of Alan Berg, who regularly debated Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis who would call his radio station, who gunned him down outside of his home. There were bombings of churches and also Jewish houses of worship. There was also the murder of an Ethiopian student in 1988 here in Portland, Oregon, the murder of Mulugeta Sarah. Many of us began to come together across lines of politics, across lines of religion, to figure out how did we respond to this rising hate and hate violence that was happening in our communities. Now, we didn't all get along. Some of us were punk rockers. Some of us were people of color. Some were white. Some were Republicans. Some were business owners. We often say that we built a broad coalition that is almost unique in the sense that you could find a Republican rancher sitting next to a blue-haired punk rocker. As I said, we didn't agree on everything, but we understood bigotry wasn't the answer to our problems. That fundamentally, it wasn't about left or right, or Republican or Democrat, or conservative or liberal, that this was a conversation around whether we were going to have a society that was grounded in inclusion or one that was grounded in violence and exclusion. We began to monitor these groups and to work with communities across the region in 6 states to try to figure out how we could respond. This included law enforcement, grassroots community groups. This included churches. This included synagogues. This included mosques, right? We were simply trying to respond to a level of violence that was disrupting all of our lives. At the end of the day, while we didn't have the answers, we knew that we wanted communities where everyone could live, love, work, and worship free from hate. Where does anti-Semitism come into this story? Well, it's briefly this. As we were monitoring, and I have to tell younger folks, this was pre-internet, so there was no Googling of things. You had to kind of begin to research. And one of the ways that we researched was the collection of hate flyers. So we would collect flyers, people would send flyers to us that they found in their communities. Flyers were the primary way that the white nationalist movement and other hate groups promoted their bigotry. As we collected and cataloged these flyers, it became pretty obvious there was something very unique about these flyers. Now look, they were vilely racist and anti-Black and anti-Latino. They were homophobic, right? Targeting the gay and lesbian community, targeting those who have been diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. They targeted immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, and poor people, including the homeless. No matter who was being targeted, though, in most of the flyers, and I'm going to say, without, I think, exaggerating, within like 85% of the flyers, you would note that there was always some caricature of Judaism or Jews, right? The stereotypical trope of the Jewish merchant, many have seen that anti-Semitic image, would appear on many of these flyers. You would see a Star of David. You would see references to things like the Zionist occupational government. The most prolific and common was usually one that showed like a Jewish rabbi or the Jewish merchant holding strings like he was a puppet master, pulling the strings of Black people or gays or lesbians, whoever was the anxiety of the week. It became very clear to us that Jews and Judaism played a big role in the understanding of the white nationalist movement. In short, many of us who weren't Jewish came to understand that anti-Semitism wasn't merely just at the core of white nationalism. It was actually the core of white nationalist theory. And we understood that it was so central to white nationalism, this rising violent movement, that many of us who were committed to racial justice knew that we could not win opportunity and racial equity without also being active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. In short, amongst the 21st century white nationalist movement, Jews were cast in the same role that they had always played for anti-Semites, as the absolute others, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, right? On behalf of a concept that white nationalists believed called white genocide, that Jews were merely out to destroy the white race or white Christianity. At the foundation of that modern day claim was an explicit idea that Jews were a separate race. Their anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish bigotry wasn't merely an anti-religious one. It didn't just see Jews as a religious or cultural other. It placed Jews as something other than white. And they would argue that, in fact, the fact that larger society saw Jews as white was a trick, right? And some described it as the greatest trick that the devil ever played, that being seen as white made Jews an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. What became clear to me was that in the struggle against white nationalist violence, that Jews were central to their narrative story. It was that invisible Jewish power that they saw that explained to them how Black people who they saw as inferior, right, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, or how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, or how immigrant workers could successfully challenge economic inequality. Folks ask me often, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? And I tell folks it's everywhere. It's when we see the Tree of Life shooter, right, say that Jews were committing a genocide against white people. He was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. And it is such rabid anti-Semitism, which is the framework upon which that movement functions. People often don't understand that, in fact, anti-Semitism is as much of a threat to non-Jews as it is to Jews. What do I mean that it's as much of a threat to non-Jews? Well, I mean this. When we look at many of the organized hate crimes that have occurred around this country over the last 4 years, most of those mission-oriented, the ones that were plotted and planned, were driven by anti-Semitic theories. Now, I'm not saying that racism or Islamophobia or homophobia weren't also part of those killings. What I'm saying is that when we look at the mass killing in El Paso, which you mentioned this morning, Rabbi, the targeting of Latinos at a Walmart, or the targeting of African-American worshipers in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, or the targeting of Sikhs in Wisconsin, and including the targeting of Jews in Pittsburgh and Poway, what we need to understand is this, that in each of those situations, while the victims may have looked different, each of those killers believed fundamentally that they were in an existential war with the Jewish community. In short, anti-Semitism is a threat to the Jewish community, but it's also a larger conspiracy theory, a conspiracy theory that seeks to undermine democratic practice, the idea of transparent government that centers people, all people, and is accountable. At the end of the day, though, let's be clear. Anti-Semitism doesn't derive from the white nationalist movement. The white nationalist movement is merely tapping into anti-Semitism that already exists. As I've said for decades, hate groups don't bring racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, or sexism to our communities. They merely organize the bigotry that already exists. One of the ways that we respond successfully to white nationalism and other forms of political extremism is by addressing the anti-Semitism that is often tapped into in order to build power. Why is that important? Because we have to be sophisticated enough to understand that white nationalists and others aren't just spreading anti-Semitism just to spread anti-Semitism. They're utilizing anti-Semitism as an organizing vehicle in order to undermine democratic society. For instance, the white nationalist movement doesn't seek to take us back to the days of Gone with the Wind, right? They seek to overthrow the United States to create an all-white ethno-state that is free of Jews and people of color altogether. It is somewhat different than the day-to-day racial inequality that we experience in this country. But in short, if white supremacy, that day-to-day struggle around racism, is largely written on the paper of racism, we should understand that white nationalism, this emerging social movement, is written on the paper of anti-Semitism. To refuse to deal with any ideology or domination is to abet it. And fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all of our marginalized communities. That's why in 2017, I sat down with others who supported this, Bend the Arc, political research associates, to write an essay called Skin in the Game, how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. It was both a warning about what was to come. Now it may seem like conventional wisdom. In 2017, I can guarantee you, people were still rolling their eyes, I think, until Charleston. And certainly most of us after January 6th understand that it's a threat. But we still need to have more conversations and dialogue on anti-Semitism, not just outside the Jewish community, but also inside the Jewish community. Why? It does no good for someone who is non-Jewish like me to say that anti-Semitism is a threat if the Jewish community is divided on whether anti-Semitism is a threat. So it's been an honor to work with Jewish leaders, activists across the political spectrum, in communal organizations and houses of worship around the country, helping to understand how we better educate the public and how we too dive into more nuance about the impact of anti-Semitism, not just as a set of behaviors, but as an ideology that threatens inclusion and democracy. That's how we got here.
Thank you for all of that. I'm actually curious. There's a significant percentage of the Jewish community that are people of color. And I've been in spaces, actually, there was one particular space we were in together that was racially diverse. And you spoke and people asked thoughtful questions. And then when you left, there was, I would say, a debate in the room where the people who were representing communities of color looked at the Jews in the room with skepticism and said, "What do you mean you're not white? You're white, you have privilege. Don't compare our suffering with each other." And so I'm wondering how this message and this important teaching that you share, how it resonates. You know, you challenged us appropriately to think about the issue of anti-Semitism within the Jewish community. I'm curious how what you're learning and teaching and speaking about resonates in other communities, in communities of color, where you're trying to bring us all together around issues of common concern. What kind of reaction do you get in communities of color when you talk about this issue?
Yeah. So Western State Center feels we have made a lot of progress, right? So if we go back to 2017, most racial justice, and we're really talking about, we should be clear, we're primarily talking about progressive, liberal, and racial justice, right? Social change organizations. Most weren't even arguing about anti-Semitism in 2017. It wasn't even on the radar. It's an important conversation, and we continue to watch that conversation expand. But you're right. As a non-Jewish person of color, right? I get why one might be taken aback by this concept. We tend to see like racism as a uniform kind of single parallel system in our society. And we have been trained and socialized historically because of reality, right? That racial formation in this country sits on a parameter, right? On a spectrum. On one end is whiteness, and on the other end is blackness. And in between, right, are communities primarily struggling not to be black, right? Because to be black in America is to hold a very hard place of discrimination that most people can't even begin to understand or conceptualize. And so that desire, right, to try to maintain the idea of folks who are very oppressed by racial discrimination is very real. So I could see how that response might come up. Here would be my response to folks, though, to reflect on. The first is different forms of racism function in different ways. The way that we as Black people experience racism is not the same way that Native people, indigenous communities experience racism. And Latino community doesn't experience racism in the same way the Asian American community experiences racism. And what we know is that even for Muslims in this country, right, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry is also racialized, right? It's not merely a religious form of bigotry. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because we know, right, that Latinos and Sikhs and folks who aren't Muslim are regularly targeted by anti-Muslim bigotry and bias because they're perceived to be Muslim. What mostly makes those folks perceived to be Muslim is the color of their skin. So that tells us, right, the racialization of religious difference also happens in our society. In short, though, we should understand This is not about a hierarchy. Absolutely, Black and Indigenous folks are on the receiving end of racial discrimination at a level that most communities have never experienced. But that doesn't mean that they don't experience racism, right? And in the same way, the Jewish community sits in a very unique role. On one hand, yes, it has been allowed to assimilate in the society, but is it fully white? Well, I raise that question. I know other communities that are considered white, and those communities don't have to have security at their houses of worship. They don't worry about their um, places of burial being regularly vandalized. These are not things that white people typically have to worry about in a society. And so if Jews are considered white, right, it's almost temporal, right? It's conditional. And the thing about whiteness is it's never really conditional. And so, yes, do Jews experience some forms of white privilege? Absolutely. But so do members in my family who you would not recognize as Black, right? And does it mean that they don't experience racism? Well, they experience it. They just experience it in a different way. The truth is this: the visceral racism that Black and Indigenous communities experience and other communities of color are very serious. Do Jews experience that same form of racism? No, but they do experience a form of racism, and it's called anti-Semitism. And it plays out in different ways. And I'll just end it this way with a very frank remark to Jews and non-Jews. The day that anti-Semitism begins to resemble other forms of racism, right, that communities of color experience, we are all in serious trouble. Anti-Semitism, right, is based off of an idea, right, that there is a nefarious conspiratorial group, right, that is seeking to take over the world, right, through the control of media, finances. This is the core of anti-Semitism. That narrative has sparked countless acts of violence that haven't just taken the lives of Jews, but the lives of people of color. We know when anti-Semitism becomes mainstream and begins to be echoed by elected officials and government institutions, that those societies have spiraled down very, very quickly, almost without warning. So all of us, whether you think Jews are white or not, right? That's a debate that folks can continue. Please have that debate. But whether you believe that or not has nothing to do about whether you need to prioritize, along with other forms of bigotry, the need to tackle anti-Semitism. All that we have built over the last 75 years of civil rights struggle are depending on our ability to put anti-Semitism on the table within the larger civil rights movement.
Thanks for that. I want to ask one last, maybe big question, and I'm not, I laid out this morning some steps that I think are important with regards to what it looks like to combat anti-Semitism. So I'd be curious to know not how you like the sermon, because my mom will tell me that she liked the sermon, and it's okay. But really, when you think about what the steps are in combating anti-Semitism and combating hate more generally, I'm wondering what some of those key ingredients are, what the antidotes are. Maybe it's through the lens of the Western State Center that you can share a little bit about what your work looks like. But I'm curious for our congregation, what you would say some of the key elements are in combating this kind of hate of Jews and hatred that expands and affects so many people in the country.
Well, not to just be nice, but I thought your sermon this morning was incredibly powerful. And I hope it is not only heard, but I hope it's read and circulated. I would say you're right, right? The place to start, right, is having a conversation with those you know, right? And the movement and communities you are already in. Why? Because all of us need to build our muscles in having this conversation. So to have those conversations though means a few things though. You should start with those around you, right, who stumble into anti-Semitic tropes or remarks because it's a good, important conversation. But you have to enter that conversation with a little bit of humility, right? Not self-righteous anger. It's not useful to treat your friends as if they are David Duke or Louis Farrakhan, right? These are folks you are trying to pull in, not push away. And so I think starting with humility in that conversation and talking about how you reflected on what was heard, not what they said or did, right? But how it made you feel and how you understood. And then hear them with real curiosity, right? And try to understand what they were meaning and if there is a dialogue that can be open there. I think that's important, not just individuals, but with organizations who are friends and colleagues as well. The next piece, look, we can't allow elected officials to promote anti-Semitism. We have to keep the pressure on all of them, right? And again, right, this is about educating them. This is not about beating up. There's enough beating up of folks. This is about building larger communities, and that means putting in the work, right? And it may be frustrating. We may be tired of hearing someone do it like 8 times in a row and think they should know better. But at the end of the day, the conversation around anti-Semitism is too important to cut off, right, through our anger. We have to draw people out. We have to continue to wrestle with them, if I were. The third is this, though. We need to be clear and draw a moral barrier against hate, against movements whose primary purpose is the promotion of anti-Semitism. Things like QAnon, things like the white nationalist movement, perhaps even on the left, right, where you find places not where there's a dispute around national territory, but where anti-Semitism is the core philosophy, right, of a movement. We have to distance ourselves from them. Those aren't our friends right now. Those are folks who are opening up space, right, for the undermining of 75 years of civil rights struggle. And so whether they are Democrat, Republican, independent or not, right, we have to begin to be clear that there is no room for anti-Semitism, that the moment is too important. The last thing I'll just say is this. We also have to be aware, right, that multiple oppressions can work at the same time. And that's why I say we have to enter with humility. One can respond to anti-Semitism with racist tropes or connotations of our own, right? We can also treat other people differently based off of their economic, racial, or religious backgrounds. Let's be clear. Black people and Black leaders who stumble on anti-Semitism receive much more heat, right? And much more isolation than white folks who also stumble on anti-Semitism, right? We've watched that recently. Now, I'm not saying to back off, right? Don't take that message. I'm saying lean in when you have to hold people account, but hold people accountable equally, right? If you are going to treat Black leaders in a specific way, make sure white leaders are being held to the same standard. That's how we begin to kind of close the space. But on the other hand, there's a lot of work that has to be done in the non-Jewish community. And Western State Center is one of many organizations, particularly within progressive and liberal spaces that are taking on that work. We have a program called the Common Good Program that brings together leaders from around the country into cohorts to explore the impact of anti-Semitism and white nationalism on American democracy and how we begin to engage it. We have brought in labor leaders, religious leaders, musicians, and artists from around the country. That network, as other networks, continue to grow. So at the end of the day, continue to, and thank you for the support many have given to Western State Center. I think there are a few folks on here perhaps who have, but also continue to support organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, Southern Poverty Law Center, Political Research Associates. right, across the spectrum, right? We have to understand that anti-Semitism can't be fought through a partisan lens. We need a broad base of organizations and individuals who are committed to taking on anti-Semitism, not to reach a partisan end, right? But because we understand at the end of the day, it makes all of us safe.
We have just about 2 minutes left, but I do want to ask this question. We are on our day of repentance, our day of return, that at its core asserts an audacious idea that we can change, that we can be better. And so I'm wondering if you have a brief story, and I'm sure you have lots, but we really have about 2 minutes, a story of something that makes you optimistic and that keeps you going, because I'm sure there's lots of days that are hard in the work, and we're grateful for the work that you do. I see a number of questions in the chat that I'm going to follow up and send along for your team, because there's a lot more that we want to learn from you. But I'm curious if you have a story or something that makes you optimistic, that keeps you going, that makes you believe that change is possible.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. And, you know, the story I like to tell is of young kids, largely white, elementary school age, who I caught walking down a street, right? Not downtown, not a place you would expect to see them, just a pretty quiet neighborhood with signs saying Black Lives Matter. And they were signs they had made themselves. They had organized their own vigil in support of Black Lives Matters. And what was beautiful about it were all the parents following their kids as their kids were chanting their own chants and supporting one another, and watching the pride in these parents' faces. And it's a diverse set of parents, but they were there for their kids and the world that their children want. So the next generation really does bring me great hope. They know something that the rest of us have already forgotten, which is we've actually won the fight for an inclusive America. What we're experiencing is a backlash, right? Fear and anxiety around entering a new time. And so when I think about a moment of reflection and atonement, I think right now it's about finding our voices. And every day, every single day, from all sectors, I see more and more people finding their voices. I've watched personally people leave the white nationalist movement. I don't want to romanticize that, but it tells us, right, that we're at a moment where we're really building an alternative to white nationalism and a discriminatory kind of status quo, right? And what we're really building are communities that are grounded in inclusion, who are actually focused on opportunities and solutions. But what gives me hope is we know it's tough, and we know that it's hard and it's emotional and there's lots of feelings, but we're all committed to sitting at the table, even when we disagree. And that's the America that I've wanted to see all of my life. And I'm starting to see it. And I think this next generation is really going to put it forward. And we should be very proud, because many of you have raised those children and grandchildren. And this is the world that we are building. And we should continue to believe in that world to come.
Well, Eric, you are one of the builders of that world and one of our teachers. We have lots more to learn from you, and we're grateful for the work that you do. We are, another few hours, the fast ends. And you probably, maybe you've heard this before, there is this custom that Jews wish each other, that I don't understand actually, where Jews say to each other, "May you have an easy fast." Like, that's a thing that we say, and I kind of don't get it. I mean, I do. It's like, you shouldn't die from fasting. Okay, so I get that. Don't die. That's good. But it's supposed to be meaningful. It's supposed to, you're supposed to feel your guts and your heart and your body and struggle a little bit, so that we can come out on the other side when the fast ends, having found meaning. And I want to thank you for joining us in the fast and also helping make this such a meaningful time together. We look forward to welcoming you back to Shaaray Tefila. Hope that you'll come by when you are on the East Coast. You're getting applause here in the sanctuary. And we want to really express our gratitude to you for being with us. Thanks for being our teacher, and thanks for the work that you do every day. Thanks for everyone who's here in the sanctuary and everyone online. And we will see you all very soon. Thanks, Eric.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends. We'll begin Yom Kippur afternoon services in about 17 minutes.